A bit of an introduction to peak oil, what it means, some of the stats and what people around the world are doing, and then look at what's happening in Tasmania and what we've been doing, which sort of leading up to today's session later on. So first of all, the importance of oil in our lives.
Oil is concentrating millions of years of sunlight that fell all over the planet into a liquid. And then we can take that liquid, and it's so easy for us, we can burn it. We're using it up in, the blink of an eye. In the blink of an eye, we've used up nearly half of, I mean, that's incredible to me, how fast we've done it and how long it took to make this stuff. The Greeks would mix it with sulfur and put it in a clay pot, light it on fire, and it's essentially a bomb, an oil bomb. Run into these, the sterile rooms, the plastic gloves catch us as we come out. We're swaddled in polyester, and then we live our lives bathed in oil.
Sonia Shah is a journalist, not a geologist. It was while researching a book on crude that she came to realise how deeply oil has seeped into our modern lives.
Some drip of oil has entered into almost everything we do. What's happened a lot of times now is even simple foods have become more and more complicated because people need things to be convenient. The so-called value added, which means a lot of petrochemicals and petroleum products. These vegetables, I would suspect, are all grown quite far away from where we are right now. So they've been sitting on refrigerated trucks for several days, burning diesel, on our asphalt roads. And the whole thing's wrapped in, in a hard plastic. This is a natural food that has oil added to it. The average American uses about 3 gallons of oil every day. And that's probably a gallon for travel, a gallon on their products, and a gallon in their food. From, our food to our clothes to our medicine cabinets to our toothpaste, it's really everywhere.
That's a bit about the importance of oil in our lives, but what about peak oil, the topic of the forum today?
Most people, when they think about oil, think of when we're going to run out. And really that's the wrong question to ask, because oil in the earth is not like oil, gasoline in the gas tank of your car. When your car runs out of gas, then there's a problem. But it doesn't run out until you get to the last drops. But with oil in the earth, it's a very different situation. We can't just pump oil out of the earth at any arbitrary rate.
All oil production, whether it's in one oil field or one country or the planet as a whole, always follows a bell curve. When you drill your first well, if the oil's close to the surface under pressure, you get a gusher. You drill more wells, the pressure goes down, the table goes down. But also you're pumping out the light sweet oil, which has risen to the top. The heavier, more expensive oil to refine, the harder to get oil, is obviously way down deep.
And you have to start pumping in water or carbon dioxide or natural gas if you've got some around, and start forcing the oil out, just as is happening in Saudi Arabia. So what you get is this curve. It starts, pulls up quite quickly, get more and more and more out, then you reach this peak or plateau.
When you get to about the halfway point, the rate that you can extract the resource peaks. And after that point, no matter how much effort you put into it, you can't continue extracting the resource at the same rate. The rate of extraction peaks and begins to fall.
So what he just said there was that peak oil, looking at the rate of oil production over time, peak oil is not when we run out of oil, but when production peaks, after which it enters terminal decline. And we are here, or at least somewhere very close to that point. We're on top of that plateau. How do we know this? Well, if we look back into the history of individual nations' oil production, here's the production from the United States up to 1956. And it looks like from that data, it's only going in one direction, and that's up. But a man by the name of Hubbert, a geologist, looked at all of the individual wells, their capacity, the pressure and how much was left and how easily it could be extracted, summed them all up and predicted that the US oil production would actually look more like this. The actual experience was pretty close. So that's what happened in the US. You can see it peaked between 70 and 72. The impact of that was cars lining up to petrol stations, people lining up to petrol stations, and petrol stations actually running out of petrol altogether. Now, it wasn't just the US production that caused this. There were oil embargoes and geopolitical stuff going on as well, but it was largely contributed to by the peak of US oil production. Globally, well, with oil, first you've got to find it, then you've got to get it out of the ground, and then you use it. So in terms of finding oil, the rate at which we've found it peaked back in 1965 at 150 million barrels per day. Between 2002 and 2007, it's down to about a sixth of that value. On supply, it's falling in more than 60% of the world's 98 oil-producing countries. It peaked at 74 million barrels per day back in July 2008. So we haven't actually produced as much oil as we did in July 2008 over the last 3 years. And we may never. That may have actually been peak oil. It's on the rise. In fact, it's fluctuating up and down as it always does. On the demand side, it's increased ninefold since 1965 when we discovered the most we'd ever discovered. It's well and truly on the rise. Think about China and India and their wanting to live the same affluent lives that we do in developed countries. And this is a really telling statistic. 1981 was the last year that we found more oil than we used. It's been 30 years now. This is the same picture. I should say not a pretty picture. So this first graph is discoveries of oil and then what we expect to discover into the future. The next one here is how much we've produced and how much we expect to produce, and then how much we've used and how much we'd like to use. But this gap between how much we'd like to use and how much we actually think we're going to get out of the ground, that is basically the issue of peak oil. A few quotes. This is from the CEO of Total Oil, which is a big oil company. We are running the risk of another oil crisis when demand outstrips supply around 2014 or 2015. There won't be enough oil and gas by the middle of the next decade. That was back in 2009, so he's actually talking about this decade. From a former US Energy Secretary, we are not good at recognising distant threats, even if their probability is 100%. Society ignoring peak oil is like the people of Pompeii ignoring the rumblings below Vesuvius. From the European Commissioner for Energy, the amount of oil available globally, I think, has already peaked. And that was in 2010. So this is not some left-wing loony conspiracy theory that we're going to one day run out of oil. There are white middle-aged men with grey hair and business suits waving their arms at us, warning us that this is upon us now and that we need to do something about it. A bit closer to home, let's see what our politicians have got to say.
Does the Liberal Party have a policy on peak oil?
And we'd like it to be cheaper. That's, I suppose. We'd like to see competition at every level in the oil industry, both at the production level, at the distribution level, and at the supply level. And we think that that will give us the best possible price.
I was going to ask if Tony understood the question about peak oil. Are you clear with the concept of peak oil?
If he is, he can explain it to me.
It's not a term I have heard. Perhaps Robert knows about peak oil. He's the expert on arcane concepts. Maybe you can explain it to us, Robert.
Well, it's a concept which is concerned with the point at which oil production is beginning to decline, where the exploration and production we realise we're over a point and we're beginning to decline. It's actually an incredibly complex notion. It's one that I wouldn't claim to be an expert on, but I know that it's absolutely central to the debate about energy.
Yeah, okay, but the issue with oil then is a function of, I mean, supply is very much a function of price, and at a higher price, all sorts of things suddenly become possible. A whole lot of uneconomic deposits become accessible, turning all sorts of other things into oil becomes feasible. So this idea that there is some point beyond, there's some fixed point, some fixed finitude, if you like, I just find implausible.
So you may think that I showed that just to take the piss out of Tony Abbott, but what he said at the end there is actually true. The amount of oil that we can get out of the ground depends on the price that we sell it for, because we can start to extract more expensive deposits. But it's kind of missing the point, because by the time the price has gone up, well, that's what we were concerned about in the first place. The price is going up because we've run out of cheaply extractable oil. Now, let's look at where that extra oil is going to come from when the price does go up and we can start to extract this more expensive stuff. Well, this graph is from the International Energy Agency, from their World Energy Outlook in 2010, which was released in December last year. And traditionally, the International Energy Agency has been very conservative about their estimates of how much oil is remaining. And by conservative, I mean optimistic. It wasn't until their 2010 outlook that they actually acknowledged peak oil. But not only did they acknowledge it, they actually said it happened back here in around 2008. But they're still fairly optimistic. I mean, the amount of oil, or how long oil is going to last for, how much we can get out of the ground, depends on lots of different things. The state of the global economy, political conflicts in oil-producing regions, a whole bunch of different things. So this is under the new policies scenario, which is the policies that the International Energy Agency is suggesting would be put in place to achieve 450 parts per million of atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is too high in most people's opinion, but may be politically feasible. Even then, we haven't really even taken the actions required to get down to 450 parts per million. So even this could be optimistic. But anyhow, let's have a look at where they think this extra oil is going to come from. So this main section here is currently producing fields. These next two sections are oil fields that are yet to be developed and oil fields that are yet to be found. So let's have a look at what they look like.
There's not a lot of easy oil left to be found, otherwise we would have found it, and that's what we would be targeting. Right now we're pushing out to more remote areas, we're pushing out to deeper water, whether it's Gulf of Mexico or even offshore Alaska, and continually looking for larger accumulations.
In the Gulf of Mexico, they produce twice as much oil as on Alaska's North Slope. And there's little close to shore that remains untapped. So companies are going further than ever before.
Discover Deep Seas, Chevron, 0 Charlie Victor.
Deep Seas, go ahead.
Nearly 100 miles offshore, this ship is drilling one of the deepest holes ever drilled in the Gulf of Mexico. Chevron is drilling down more than 5 miles, as deep as Mount Everest is tall, all to look for oil that might be hidden in 7-million-year-old rocks.
Isn't modern technology amazing that we can dig down 5 miles deep to extract oil from the ground?
Look at the water on fire. The water's on fire, dude.
So this is footage from two fishermen of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2009, and I'm sure you remember these remarkable images of oil gushing out of the ocean bed. The environmental impacts were just shocking, really, to bird life, to fish, to marine mammals, to the whole ecosystem. And that also had a lot of human and social impacts, affecting the local economy of fisheries and tourism, and that trickling down through the rest of the economy as well. The clean-up effort was enormous. And it just took so long to plug because it was at such a deep depth. I think it went on for, was it 3.5 months or something between the initial incident and the leak actually being plugged successfully. And they tried all of these weird and wonderful ways of blocking it up with all sorts of very creative gadgets. You can see the footage here of some of the underwater robotics attempting to seal up the leak. Of course, it's exceptionally difficult to do at that depth and had never been attempted before. The geographical scale of the oil spill was also phenomenal. So this is showing a time-lapse animation of how the oil spread throughout the Gulf and then further out into the Atlantic Sea over 3.5 months. And this is what the spill would have looked like if it had happened, if the epicentre was in Hobart. That's the size and scale of the spill. Another area that we're expecting to meet this world demand is unconventional oil. So let's have a look at that.
There was an old couple that lived here. They died last winter. Yeah, the old lady died of cancer again, and the old man just gave up. He didn't want to live no more.
I'm a good person. Like, what did I deserve to get cancer at 17 years old?
What is making people in Fort Chippewa sick?
Heavy metals, arsenic, mercury, cadmium, zinc, iron, naphthenic acids, you name it.
The genocide of the Fort Chippewa people is at stake.
There are so many of our people dying of cancers that are so rare, according to our doctor.
My gut feeling is there has to be some connection with industry and what's happening here.
Alberta sits over one of the largest recoverable oil patches in the world, second only to Saudi Arabia. An area larger than England, it holds at least 175 billion barrels of crude bitumen.
Digging the bitumen out of the ground, squeezing the oil and converting it into synthetic crude is a monumental challenge. It requires vast amounts of capital. In short, it is an enterprise of epic proportions, akin to building the pyramids or China's Great Wall, only bigger.
There's nowhere else on Earth where we're talking about destroying an area the size of Florida. There is nowhere else on Earth where you have toxic ponds that are so big that you can now see them from space.
The Alberta government has no clue as to the actual state of the Athabasca River.
But we're not going to have any clean drinking water in these mountains if these guys are allowed to get away with what they're going to do.
Oh my God. There's nothing in there. Just go.
I really do feel the great economic boom is going to be a great economic disaster and devastation to our land and people.
We've dabbled with nature for so long, and we screw it up every time. Leave it alone.
So we looked at the deep oil, the hard-to-access oil, and then we've looked at unconventional oil. Another impact of our oil dependence are wars. And I put this together, this little clip from a few parts of Australian TV.
And if there was Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, well...
But they knew he didn't.
Yeah. They knew he didn't, you say?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm. You mean the Howard government knew he didn't?
It should have. I think the British government did, the American government did, and the Australian government should have.
Okay, well, I could pursue that for quite a while, but we actually have a question.
Prime Minister, has oil got anything to do with this conflict?
No, I don't believe for a moment it has.
Despite previously being adamant it wasn't a reason for going to war in Iraq, the federal government now says oil is one of the reasons Australian troops are staying there. Launching the government's latest defence update, the Prime Minister says energy security, including oil, is something Australians need to think about when considering the consequences of a premature withdrawal from Iraq.
First, it was about weapons of mass destruction. Then it was terrorism. Now, oil has become a reason for the war in Iraq.
Obviously, the Middle East itself, not only Iraq, but the entire region, is an important supplier of energy, oil in particular.
Today, the Prime Minister launched Australia's latest defence update, and securing oil supplies from the trouble region is highlighted as justification for staying the course.
So we're trashing the environment, we're harming people's health, we're sending our troops to war, all for this very valuable resource that our society's hooked on, and we need to keep working out ways to get more and more and more of it. And obviously the only solution here is to work out other ways of living, other ways of running society that use much less oil, or even, I'd like to envisage a future one day where we are completely without the need for at least crude oil. What it means for Tassie, here's just a quick list of things that are kind of summarised from the Peak Oil Tasmania website. So transport, obviously that's going to become much more expensive, not just for transporting people in our cars, but also goods. Exports, particularly by air, and we do have a lot of exports by air, things that go off quickly like seafood and things that we want to send to the opposite hemisphere. So we're getting that premium for selling off-season produce, so cherries and that sort of thing. International tourism. Fortunately, Tasmania's tourism is actually mainly domestic tourism, and the international component isn't as large as I used to think. So we're probably not too vulnerable there. Perhaps once oil prices start really going up, then more Australians will stop flying off to overseas locations and start coming more to Tasmania. So it could actually benefit us in that regard. The state budget, just the state economy as a whole, investment in the state could lead to unemployment, less disposable income, and for the least well off in the community, that's going to mean fuel poverty. So houses further away from services and from employment, they'll relatively drop in price compared to houses that are closer to services and employment. So people who are already poor will be living further away, and then their fuel bills will be higher to boot. So that's a sort of compounded impacts on the most needy in our community. Food security can also be an issue, particularly in the longer term, because we use oil also to produce fertilisers and pesticides, which the majority of the world's sort of food production systems depend upon. Access to health services, again, mainly because of the transport. There's a whole lot more, and we've actually got a bunch of different Tasmanians who have got expertise or experience in different areas to write articles on the key aspects of peak oil and how it will impact specifically on the Tasmanian communities, and also some ideas as to what we should do about it. On the solutions, this is a quote: "I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that." Anyone guess who said that? It was Thomas Edison in 1931. And along those lines, there's a group called Beyond Zero Emissions, and they've developed the Zero Carbon Australia 2020 plan, which is a plan to move the whole of Australia to 100% renewable energy within 10 years. And that's not just our current electricity needs, but also our transport needs. It's only using available technology, and it's fully costed out. It's expensive, but it is actually technically feasible and economically feasible. There are a whole bunch of really big challenges here, not the least of which are economic. There are also some technical challenges. And personally, I'm not a fan of just leaving it up to technology to solve everything. I don't think it's possible, because even if you do manage to solve a few of the problems, such as peak oil and climate change in the short term, you're just maintaining a system that's unsustainable in many other ways. Okay, another solution is biofuels, but then we get into the problem of fuel versus food, or I'd prefer to say cars versus people. So growing crops to make into oil, to put into our cars, when in fact, there are people in the world that are going without food. And biofuels, particularly ethanol made from corn, was one of the contributors to the global food crisis in, was it 2007 or 2008? In driving the price of food up, which exacerbated the impacts of the world food crisis. Solutions other than technical: building community resilience, relocalising our economy, urban planning to reduce dependence on private motor cars, which I think will be a big theme today, removing petrochemicals from our food production, redirecting fossil fuel subsidies to alternatives. Now, what's happening in Australia? The Maribyrnong Council have produced what's currently the best report from a local council in Australia, and we're lucky enough to have one of the lead authors of this report speaking at our event today. Hepburn Springs, they've just put a request for expression of interest out to do what's called an Energy Descent Action Plan, or EDAP, which has sort of been born out of the Transition Towns movement, and it's a way at looking across the community and planning for how to descend the amount of energy that we need so that we can become more resilient to peak oil and also to climate change. So it's only in the very early stages. They just put the request for expressions of interest. Consultants will be putting in expressions to perform that work, but it'll be really interesting to see how it goes, because it'll be the first EDAP in Australia. And we're lucky enough to have the Mayor, isn't it? The Mayor of Hepburn Springs, who's been very supportive of all of this, speaking later today as well. Sorry?
It's the first in Australia. They haven't anywhere else?
Yes, in Totnes. Totnes in the UK have
They've actually got a plan.
Yep. There's a book about energy descent action plans and the learnings from the Totnes one. I think there's one downstairs, or it's for sale from Sustainable Living Tasmania. Sunshine Coast has also done, and this is important, combining looking at peak oil and climate change at the same time, because a lot of the things that we need to do to solve them are the same. A lot of the impacts will affect us in the similar ways, so thinking about them simultaneously when we're planning how to respond is really important. But that one probably doesn't go into nearly as much detail as Maribyrnong, or what we're hoping the Hepburn Springs stuff will go into. Locally in the Huon Valley, Greens councillor and Sustainable Living Tas board member Liz Smith has passed a motion. I'm not exactly sure of the details there, but it's something to do with the council looking at peak oil. She's also speaking today, and she's been over at local council conference over in Melbourne, so she's going to be speaking about that today as well. What the Tasmanian government is doing, in June 2010, Nick McKim announced, the title of the press release was "A Study for Prosperity Beyond Peak Oil," and there's a few quotes from the press release. So I think Nick McKim had the best intentions here, but the process that the government has actually gone through to produce this report so far has been quite disappointing. They've sort of dropped any oil supply questions from the study and are focusing purely on price fluctuations and their impact. It's still a useful thing to do, but it just hasn't gone nearly as far as I would have hoped. A couple more slides just to run you through what we've been doing. We just looked at what councils and state government are doing. Now what we as community groups have been doing. Sustainable Living Tas has been raising awareness about this for years, and it seems like the issue is finally starting to get some attention, which is great. We've helped to establish and support 30 local community groups who are following the Transition Towns model, and they're working to increase resilience to peak oil and climate change. Sorts of activities they're doing: community gardens and orchards, community supported agriculture, bulk purchases of solar panels and solar hot water systems and electric bikes, and education, feeding into local council planning and sharing resources. We also ran a workshop here in, I think it was September last year. We had about 70 people along, listening to a few talks about what was happening in the community to build resilience for peak oil, and then later in the afternoon actually sitting down and planning out, what is it that we can do at different levels on different themes to build our resilience. Out of that workshop, a new community group was born, Peak Oil Tasmania, which is organising today's event. Definitely check out the website peakoiltas.org. There's heaps of really great information on there. And that leads us to today, the forum that we're holding this afternoon.